Welcome to the Insurgent Mindset. I'm Matt Tice.
And I'm Rondo Moses. This is a podcast about challenger thinking in a world shaped by disruption.
And in every episode, we try to explore strategies and leadership mindsets, particularly the latter, that help businesses break from the pack and stay ahead in fast-changing markets.
You hear conversations, case studies, and insights from leaders who are helping to shape the way that organizations and other leaders thrive in an uncertain environment.
The Insurgent Mindset's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and we'd encourage you to subscribe and join our growing community interested in this topic. And also have a look at insurgentsgroup.com for more information for each podcast. What we do is create a blog that sort of describes the key themes and insights from each of our podcasts. Now let's get into it,
Great.
Rondo.
All right. Sounds great.
Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about productivity. This keeps coming up, and we had a discussion recently about construction in our podcast, and
Mhm.
one of the the themes of that was the decline over really quite a long period of time of productivity in construction. And we got a lot of feedback, people asking questions about what is productivity, what does it mean? I'm in Australia. Here in Australia, we there's been a lot of talk about the productivity crisis, similar in the UK, a little bit different in North America where you are, Rondo.
Yeah.
So what we thought we'd do was dedicate an episode to really unpack what is productivity, what does it mean, and why in some markets is productivity growing and in other markets not so much.
Right. But I think your earlier point that it's important to start with how to think about productivity, because I think the more traditional way that people think about it, I know for a long time, the way I thought about it was simply as the output per employee or output per man hours. I think that's more the traditional way that people think about it, right?
Well, I guess there's an official definition, especially for national productivity in terms of how these things get measured. So to your point,
Right.
output, which is the numerator, typically that's measured by either GDP or gross value added, very similar. We don't have to parse those terms too much, but basically these are measures of national output. And that's typically divided by the denominator, obviously, labor input, which is, to your point, measured in hours of labor. Okay, so
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
simply, what did we accomplish for the labor that we put into it gives us a productivity metric or ratio. Okay, and um, we'll assume that this audience understands GDP and GVA, but maybe if we have time at the end, we can kind of break these down a little bit more. But ultimately, this is a rough and simple metric, and there are some challenges with that. And we could look at, potentially if we wanted to get more sophisticated, there are other ways to look at that. Total factor productivity is another one which
Right.
tries to bring into the equation the employment of capital in how productivity is calculated. Now, this isn't a technology podcast, so breaking down that equation's probably beyond the scope of our discussion. But fundamentally, it's a function again of output being a function of both capital input and labor input, and how those things come together to then create a factor productivity statistic, which gives us a slightly more nuanced view of that. But anyway, the bottom line is that ultimately the numerator is the output, the denominator is the input, and obviously as that uh, as that increases, the productivity increases, and as it decreases, it declines. And what we really want to discuss here today is, what are the drivers for national productivity? Why are some economies growing faster than others? In particular, selfishly, I'd like to talk a little bit about Australia and some of the challenges that we're facing here. and maybe some of the root causes of that. And, for you, why is the US such a dynamic economy from a productivity point of view? And maybe we can draw some lessons for, why is there a contrast and what are some of the challenges and how could we overcome those? And
Yeah.
ultimately, for us, I think for the podcast listener, it's probably less about national productivity, but more about what does this mean for you and how to think about productivity in your firm.
Right. And when we get to that conversation, I want to emphasize the point that I think it's beyond just thinking of productivity as, output to, input. I think it's more about the value creation component of, productivity that people I think are missing. Because, as I think about it, you can spend, a lot of time being very active and doing a lot of tasks, but if the tasks don't really create value, then you don't really deliver much to your customers. So we'll talk about it when we get there, but I want to really push how we really should be thinking about that at the company and firm level.
Okay, I think that's fair, and certainly when you add all that up, it sort of shows up in the national statistics. So
Right.
I suppose at the highest level, what really drew my attention to this is that here in Australia, there's been a lot of talk about the productivity plateau, productivity decline. Have we lost our edge? Is this a the how does this affect the quality of life for Australians, et cetera? And it is true that we have reached a plateau in productivity, that productivity has declined, particularly across the economy since COVID, which ironically was a bit of a bubble, primarily
Mm,
because the denominator in terms of hours worked collapsed, and therefore the total went up, and there was a lag in terms of output still held up before that output started to ebb a little bit. So that's certainly a big factor. And fundamentally in Australia, the fact is that our total national output, as measured by GDP primarily, is growing 0.8, 1.0, is predicted to sort of max out at sort of 2% growth in sort of intermediate RBA, Royal Bank of Australia forecasts over the next couple of years. So it is meant to tick up. But, we're sort of in the, 0.8 to 1.5% GDP growth range. And, fundamentally, um, it's just that our numerator is not growing at the rate that our denominator is growing. So that's obviously
mm,
pulling us down.
mhm. In the US, I think for the past 2 or 3 decades on average, it's been about 1.5%. But if you look at, pre-COVID and post-COVID, I think the data shows that we're doing about 2.2, 2.3% growth GDP. So doing much better than many of the European countries because we did much better during COVID. And a lot of that, I think, is because we have a couple of the standout technology players who have been very successful. And I think that they are really, it's a handful of them who are really driving the GDP numbers in the right direction for the US. I mean, I think McKinsey did a study and they showed, I think they surveyed like 8,300 companies in their survey. And out of that, only 100 companies were the standouts that really drove most of, I think something like 70, 80% of the GDP results for those 8,300 companies. So the value is not evenly spread in terms of where and how productivity gains are being delivered in a country. In US for us,
Okay.
it's Amazon, it's Nvidia, Apple, for example, but it's a handful.
Right. And these companies have steep growth and obviously are driving GDP, so that plays a big role. But
Yeah.
still, I think there are structural elements to the US economy that kind of creates a situation where um, you're more predisposed to higher productivity potentially than other economies in many ways. So let's start with the US and we'll sort of break that down and then maybe we'll shift a little bit and talk about Australia. But Rhonda, what are some of the kind of the key drivers for US productivity? Like break it down for us. Give us a sense of what some of those levers are.
Again, if I'm thinking about the levers that have resulted in our current GDP performance, I think it's the fact that you have companies like Nvidia, like Amazon, and Apple who have really been focusing on, for example, reshaping the customer value proposition, introducing new business models that create more value than previous business models. I think another, and in addition, these technology companies have required that there be an upskill in the workforce. So I think another big reason during the pandemic that our GDP did well was because you had a lot of people who quit and changed jobs. And where they changed jobs, they went to upskill themselves as opposed to downskill. So they left lower skills jobs and moved to higher skills jobs. All of those things help to contribute to better GDP results and better GDP growth. So I think it's a combination of the talent pool. I think it's a combination of the types of companies that we have who have been more innovative in terms of their business models. These companies thinking about value creation and the value proposition to their customers and reshaping that. That's all I think added more productivity to the U.S. market.
Okay, so let's break down some of those components. So one is, you're talking at the company level about technology, right? So a lot of these companies are introducing technologies that are designed to improve productivity, right? So
Hmm.
NVIDIA with AI, Apple with mobility, et cetera, right? So the list is really long. So the chain of technology introduction to diffusion into the economy is quite short in America, right? So from that point of view, I think that the diffusion of these technologies that drive more output per labor hour is quite quick in the US and potentially slower in other markets for various reasons. Obviously, the US market is big and really competitive, plays another role in that, which is, kind of creating a situation where these companies are constantly refining these offerings and bringing this technology to the market. So I think that's a big part of it is, you have a highly educated workforce, to your point, that's continuously upgrading that sort of that education, which then translates into ideally, or certainly the statistics show this, more output per hour. Then you have
Right.
technology diffusion, which drives that. And then you have a very rich kind of liquid capital market, which is, constantly reallocating capital to new innovation, which, is the envy of the world. Really, many other jurisdictions don't have this kind of, capital being employed at the rate that it does in the US, innovation
Hmm.
capital. So I think that plays a big role too. And Rondo, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the culture, right? So I always wondered in the statistics, are the real hours captured in that denominator? My sense is that American workers are increasingly 24/7, and I wonder if they're just counting the 8-hour day in these statistics. So I don't know if the real hours are captured. I'm being a bit cheeky here, Rondo, but but I guess the point though is go, 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 hard driving culture, work, work, work. We'll come back to your point earlier about whether that's every hour is actually deployed correctly. But what do you think? Is it a cultural factor?
Well, I mean, I do think that you have a valid point in that, especially when you're thinking about a salaried worker, that person gets a salary and it's based on a 40-hour work week. But the reality is that, they're working on lots more than 40 hours a week. Most of those salaried workers are doing that. And I would imagine that the surveys are not capturing the hours over the 40-hour work week for that salaried worker. So yeah, I do believe that there are probably hours that are not being captured by the surveys. But at the same time, I want to push back and say that I do believe that from what I've read, many economists don't believe that, for example, AI the benefits of AI have even been factored into GDP growth just yet. Why? Because lots of organizations haven't really implemented AI in a way that would improve productivity. So there's not been integration into strategy. They haven't revised any workflows around, AI. That's really where you get the boost in productivity when you reimagine your workflows, when you upskill workers to absorb or benefit from this new technology. That's why I made the point that I think there are several companies, a small handful of companies that are really having the outsized impact on our national GDP growth, like the NVIDIAs, like the Amazon, and like Apple.
I agree with you, Rondo. I think where AI shows up most is in the growth of the companies fueling AI.
Right,
I read something I thought was really quite entertaining, which was that AI seems to be showing up everywhere except for the productivity statistics. So
right,
now I think there's an interesting parallel to that sort of, let's call it 1988 to 2001. There was an expectation of a big productivity boom with the internet, right?
right,
Sort of with computing and the internet kind of coming through. And that productivity really lagged, right? So the productivity statistics showed a relative, was still in the background phase and actually plateaued during that period, didn't grow as these technologies were being absorbed. And some of that technology upside didn't come until much later. So I think potentially with AI, it'll play that role again. It's not universally diffused through the economy. That will take
right.
a relatively long period of time, although maybe shorter than some other technology introductions. But certainly, it's not the steam engine. It is coming more quickly. But ultimately, you're right. I think that in order to see that at a mass level, that more output is being created per labor hour. Mm, Not for a few years anyway, I don't think.
Right. It takes a while to implement, change your workflow to fit this new technology. Right now, you may have people experimenting it with AI and one-offs, but you're not seeing wholesale changes in workflows and business models based around this new technology because you're not creating additional value. And that's really where the value of these new technologies is how do I free up people to do more high value work than low value work? Another thing, data that came up as I was preparing for the conversation was that I think it's something like 40 to 60% of knowledge workers spend the bulk of their time, most knowledge workers spend the bulk of their time on low value activities. So they're not even focused on the high value activities. So the goal would be for technology like AI being able to take away some of that low value activities that then they can shift their time to higher value activity or even just reimagining their roles altogether. That's really where you would get the productivity lift.
Yeah, only though, Rondo, only if that shift creates more output per hour, the way it's measured, right? So if you're
Hmm.
still spending the same amount of hours, even though you're putting more time into higher value tasks, that has to be monetized through greater output. There's no other way to look at it, right?
Right.
So, and I think this is like a fallacy of productivity in a sense of, maybe there's a productivity dividend, but if that dividend is spent giving workers a break, but they're still working the same hours and the demand for the products and services hasn't changed, therefore the output hasn't changed, maybe that's a market constraint almost, then the actual figures don't actually show a higher productivity. You know what I mean?
But
So I think
but
we have to be careful about, yeah,
doesn't that depend on which way you look at productivity? So if you're focusing on labor productivity, for example, I could see that. But what about total factor productivity, where you're pulling out the costs associated with producing the good, right? So you're really starting to tap into the value added creation from that work. I think more economists are starting to look at total factor productivity as one that sort of speaks to increased productivity than just looking at labor productivity.
fair enough. Okay, so I don't disagree with that. Um, but again, ultimately, what we need to think about are what are the things that are going to drive greater productivity. So, like we said, technology diffusion, more educated workforce. We haven't talked about friction, so particularly at a
Right.
national level, less regulation. Therefore, that plays a key role, and other types of friction play a role there too. So all these things kind of add up. Intensity of competition plays a role. So there's a whole
Right.
bunch of things, and I think, particularly in the U.S., these things are very dynamic.
Well,
Now,
that's why, reshaping, I'd mentioned reshaping or reimagining the customer value proposition is a way that you can increase productivity without, cutting your employees, right? So if you have reimagined the value proposition and that value proposition delivers greater value to customers, then you can increase your productivity. For example, Home Depot did that with, expanding its inventory levels online, as well as making the in-store and online more connected. That added more productivity to Home Depot. So it's one of the companies that were mentioned as really contributing to increased productivity in the US. So I think it's just thinking about how do you think differently about how do you drive that productivity. So the customer value proposition, upskilling your talent, realigning your workflows to sort of deliver higher value, those are ways that you can drive more increased productivity with the same amount of people that you have.
agree with all of that, right? So certainly, um, anyway, before we get into sort of firm level productivity, let's talk about, can I just for a minute talk a little bit about Australia? Um,
Yes, of course.
so, I think, so I think one of the challenges that, certainly we're facing here is a relative lag in productivity. I think the UK probably is experiencing something very
Yeah.
similar. And certainly in the EU zone, this plays a role here as well. So, where we might be sort of plus or minus 0.5% of productivity growth year on year. You mentioned 2.5% in the US. On a comparative basis, that means that we're falling behind. And that shows up in a relatively flat GDP and more labor hours worked per period than perhaps before, which here at least is driven in part by immigration, not necessarily individuals working more hours, right? So
Hmm.
although that is slightly faster than GDP, so Australians are working a little bit more, maybe just marginally more than that GDP growth, but our economy is not the same as the US in a sense that we have, really only one, maybe two industries that kind of compete at scale where um, where
Hmm.
these are competitive on the global scale, at a global scale. So one of those is mining, right? So we are a mining economy. We'll come back to that because from that point of view, that's also problematic on the numerator. But this is a this is an industry here which is um, globally competitive and productive. Um, we talked before about construction, and I think we also mentioned in our previous podcast, healthcare and education being at the bottom of the barrel. Those are the same for the U.S. as they are here in Australia. These
Yeah.
these are still at the bottom of the barrel, but our other sort of scale, our other scale industry is agriculture. Although not, again, not at the scale of the US or China, or even maybe Ukraine, for example. But you know, we are at scale in certain parts of the agriculture value chain, but virtually everything else, we don't have national scale. So the idea that we can, harvest those scale economies to create higher productivity is much less available to us. So we have to compete more on value in niche industries potentially, or internal to our own economy. So I think that's one. I think the second is that um, we probably have we have more regulatory friction than in the US. This is a reasonably heavily regulated economy. And so that's, not great. There's a lot that's been discussed about, how to reduce that regulation or at least to reduce the friction that regulation creates, which
Hmm.
is really, I think, an important productivity driver. And I think one thing we didn't talk about with the US versus Australia is that we have relatively low labor mobility here. So
Ah,
labor sort of moving, from one jurisdiction to the next, chasing the next opportunity.
yeah,
Um, so we do have labor mobility. It tends to be a little bit more static than it is in the US.
right.
I think that's a big issue. So, labor ebbing and flowing to where those opportunities are, plays a big role.
Yeah,
So,
that's definitely a big
I think
difference.
that's important.
Yeah.
And, I just recently did a webinar on capital and how capital flows in Australia. And I think, it's really fair to say that we do not have both a business culture of risk taking. Um, we also don't, I'm not saying that there's none of that, so there certainly is, but that sort of
Hmm.
liquid capital market here, where, like we talked about before, that investment capital going to things that are driving efficiency and productivity at scale is just um, much less mature here than it is in the US. So that I think that plays a big role is just that um, therefore, the diffusion of new innovation into our industries is much slower. And then, therefore, we don't get the output that you might see there. And I think that's problematic as well. And certainly, we'd like to see more of that here. But, you know, um, now, here's another thing is because it's a relatively small economy, 25 million people, we also have really highly concentrated industries. So there are
Right.
big banks, we have two big supermarket chains, we have one hardware store. You mentioned Home
Home
Depot that
Depot.
sort of represents the big part of the market. So many of our industries are really concentrated, so they have sort of these oligopoly characteristics where, you know, they're kind of competing against each other in these sort of static equilibrium, which doesn't drive a lot of innovation in many cases, which is because they're not really necessarily exposed to global innovation here in the domestic economy. Um, they don't, not working as hard as they might to drive
Hmm.
that. And then, of course, culturally, Australians don't want to work 24/7. Australians want to go to the beach, right? So, I think noticing the contrast of having lived in both places and worked in both places, I think that our culture very much separates, the Australian culture very much separates work from leisure. Um,
What about the education
plays
of
a role.
the workforce? How educated is the workforce in Australia? Is there a push more toward higher education like we have here, or are people not as, motivated to go to college, or there's not enough industry for those types of workers?
No, I would say that this is a highly educated workforce. Um, so I think the way we always talk about Australia compared to the US, right, is in the US, the highs are much higher and the lows are much lower. Okay, so I
Mm,
would say on average, we have a very educated workforce here. Okay, and that education is a priority early, in the middle, and late. But at the upper end, probably like, for example, the proportion of Australians going to grad school compared to the US would be lower. Okay. But the proportion of Australians going to, investing tons of money into private school to get a better primary education is probably way higher here. So,
okay.
we sort of fit right in the middle of that.
Hmm.
But we don't have the lows either, where, and there's a lot of other factors that we could talk about there. But, I'd say that our lowest wouldn't be as low as in the US, but our highest wouldn't be as high. So basically, it's an educated market.
Hmm.
Okay, so, and then we do have relatively high net immigration. So, that's played a big role too. So there has been particularly in the post-COVID era, the catch up from COVID. And a lot of that immigration, to your point, Rondo, comes in for education because we're a net exporter of education. Okay, so
Okay.
in other words,
Uh-huh.
particularly India, China, send people here to be educated. Okay, so
Hmm.
that plays a role too. Many of those people stay, and all that stuff. So our labor denominator has grown through immigration as well. I'm not sure that's a bad thing because we could argue on the margin whether it's a little bit too much or a little bit too little, but that has
Hmm.
also created constraints on the economy in terms of availability of housing, availability of capital, availability of jobs, things like that, which you know, um, also play a role. So, I guess fundamentally, we're not really set up for, massive growth and productivity. And,
Mm.
I think to your earlier point about AI, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have, of course, as you know, immigration is a big issue here, where people are, we have porous borders that people are very concerned about. And so there's a big push to remove people here who are undocumented, et cetera. But, our population growth is shrinking. And so we need more, I think we need immigrants to help keep the economy going. And that also has an impact on GDP in GDP growth. So having the people to do the work so that that can develop. But so we although we could benefit, I think, from more immigration, we don't have it now. I mean, I think that's not there's a policy decision now to push back on people who are here, who are undocumented, I would say. But when we do get highly educated immigrants coming from Asia and other countries. So technology in our technology space, a lot of, East Asian immigrants come here, do very well, and I think that's fueling our growth, probably working in a lot of the technology companies. So I think that's also a key driver for us because people want to get to America and land of opportunity, and they see it that way.
Yeah, but again, that's just another that's like macro labor mobility, right? So you're attracting this labor that is going to come in, it's going to work hard. If
High
you get the
skills.
smartest people, you're averaging everyone up, and that's going to create more, obviously more productive people, which then
Right.
creates more output. So, fundamentally, I think the structures of our economies are very different. So maybe shifting gears and talking about firm productivity, right? So now without getting too technical in terms of how we measure this, right? Fundamentally, still input output, right? So fundamentally, you're going to deploy labor and capital to achieve output. And what we want to do is achieve more output for obviously less of those two things. But in order to achieve more output, we have to make capital investments. And we
Hmm.
also have to upskill our workforce. So it's always finding that balance. And, for most, I think for most leaders, when we talk about firm productivity, they're really tied up in efficiency. So, how do we do what we do more efficiently? And, with AI in particular, there's a lot of discussion about AI, machine learning, robotics, et cetera, about how do we automate, maybe replace workforce, and in which case then capital productivity becomes more important.
Yeah. But I also think that, the focus on efficiency has always been there, but you could be efficient at doing the wrong things, right? So how can I think a way that those organizations that are standout organizations as it relates to productivity, the ones I mentioned, like Amazon and NVIDIA, et cetera, they are focused on finding those value, where's the real value created in the organization and focusing in on those areas and driving those areas. And I think that organizations need to be thinking that way. So it gets back to being clear about what your strategy is and what's going to drive value through that strategy and being laser focused on those things as opposed to saying, and thinking about it beyond just the individual performance level and thinking more at a system level will allow organizations to do that because you can be efficient, but as I said, you can be efficient at something that really ultimately doesn't generate a lot of value. But you're
Right.
efficient.
So it goes in both directions, right? So you could be efficient, but not productive, right?
Right.
And then you could be a productive and not efficient. So work in the other
Right.
direction, right? Like if you're inefficient, you're creating bad products, quality, having to rework, piling up inventory, all that kind of stuff. You're inefficient. But if there's huge demand for your products and you're generating output, then you could still be productive but not efficient. So it's kind of, I think
Right.
it goes both ways. So I think there's sort of a misnomer, I suppose, that productivity and efficiency are exactly the same. They're certainly very similar. But I
Right.
think the thing is, right, so um, often often firms you know, um, will fail to capitalize on the dividend for, say, for improving efficiency. So for example, if you improve efficiency or improve productivity, whatever, um, you may find that you can do more with less resource. Okay.
Right.
So now you can monetize that in two different ways. So one is I can cut resource and reduce my OpEx or whatever, right? So that's fine. So I can monetize that. And then the hope is that I maintain the same level of output for the same, for less input. Okay.
Hmm.
Right.
Hmm.
So now I think the problem with that is it's a pretty zero-sum mentality in a sense of um, now I've I've kind of monetized the wrong side of the equation. So I would rather um, reinvest that efficiency dividend to create more output rather than monetize that by reducing my labor force. You know what I
Right.
mean? So I think it's sort of like often, and then to your point, sometimes we create a situation where we can create more output with less labor, but we don't actually monetize it.
Right.
So we're more efficient or more productive and more productive, but the worker isn't doing anything important with that extra time.
Right.
So in other words, we've actually improved it, but we haven't necessarily monetized
Right.
it.
So you haven't taken the savings and invested in an innovation of some sort that's going to improve value creation, right? Ultimately.
Exactly. So I think there's three scenarios, right? So we've improved it. Great. So now in improving that, we've either harvested that improvement by reducing labor cost, right?
Hmm.
Which is then less hours per unit of output. Great, congratulations. Or maybe we've done that through, automation or whatever it is, whatever the mechanism that we use has done that. So that's one. Or two, maybe even better, if we've improved it now, and potentially what we've done is now we have excess labor, right? And whether it's that labor or different labor, how do we reinvest that dividend into growth,
Right.
right? Finding new customers, innovating to create, the next opportunity or whatever. Often I think that companies take a supply side view of this and not a demand side view, and then fail to leverage that improvement to create new growth, which then drives the numerator. But then the worst case, to your point, is that we've improved it, but we haven't capitalized on it at all. So it doesn't really show up in the numbers. We're either more efficient, but we're more efficient, but we're not more productive. And but we haven't taken a dividend out of that improvement.
Right.
I see this a lot, right? So people scurry around to create a more efficient process, but then they don't take that next step to monetize that improvement.
Why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that organizations solely focus on the efficiency piece of it, but they don't think about reinvesting back in the business to create more value?
The sugar hit, Rondo, right? It's much easier to take the short-term benefit, right? I'll cut my costs and that'll show up in the next quarter's performance.
Hmm.
As
Hmm.
compared to, I'll think deeply about now I've got a unit of labor. What does that labor look like? What does the capability look like? How do I turn that into more demand, more output, new products, other things, right? So it's kind of like, and you always got to find that balance. It also depends on where you are in the cycle. If you're not performing, the easy thing to do is to cut those resources out, lay off people, whatever it is. But I think it's easy, Rondo. It's lazy and it's easy.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of the conversation that we had with Rita McGrath from Columbia Business School when she's talking about the need for leaders to be thinking about transient advantage and always looking for ways to invest in finding, weak signals and looking for new opportunities because advantage doesn't last forever. So if you're not investing, if you're only investing in the short term and focusing on short term, you're not going to be able to benefit from a longer term strategy. You don't have a long term strategy
Hmm.
or any shifts in the market. And we know that, the market is gradually changing. There's more uncertainty in the market. So you have to be able to sort of manage the current business while also thinking about where should you be taking the business in the future or where are the future opportunities. And so having that kind of portfolio mindset of, right, there are things I got to do for the business today, but how am I setting up the business for the future? I think will be really important to improving productivity in your company.
Right. And I think that's right in terms of I like that mindset of the portfolio, right? So if you're in a space of um, obviously everyone wants to improve productivity, there's no doubt about it, right? So we want to do that. And the sort of little brother of that is we want to improve efficiency too. And some proportion of that improvement um, will drive short-term results on the bottom line, and some will drive ideally more output on the demand side. So we want to spread our bets, I guess, in terms of being
Right,
able to find things that are going to create that. But then we also have to think about how we're going to monetize that. And I think the lessons at a national level are the same lessons for the firm, right? So if you're a firm wanting to improve health productivity, right? So the list of things that you need to go through are going to be really similar. Where's the friction? Okay, so what
hmm
are the things preventing you from achieving more output per unit of capital or labor, right? So we talk a lot about on this podcast understanding the constraints that kind of govern your business. So I think it's really important to you know, at a national level, you think about the friction in terms of regulation. At the firm level, you think about the constraints in terms of policy or work practices, or to your point, maybe you have obsolete workflows, for example,
right,
so you really have to work those issues. Now, I come back to the point of once you've actually improved it, how you're going to monetize that and harvest the benefits really important. So you got to go
hmm
through that full cycle. So I think that's one. I think second is, while intra-firm, thinking about labor mobility is probably less important, but it is important in terms of how do we keep redeploying the labor and capital that we have to the next best opportunity. That
right,
portfolio mindset of, almost that atomic allocation of resources to the next best opportunity. Once you have harvested that benefit, how again am I going to be able to do that? So I guess the analogy for the firm in terms of labor or even capital productivity or mobility is being able to keep your capability fresh and evergreen, right? Which does speak to a little bit of turnover in the workforce, right? It does also speak to hiring more adaptive capability potentially than rigid functional capability. Those kinds of things I
hmm
think are really important how we think about that. So the insurgent typically is very dynamic because they're constantly juggling around resources and capital to achieve the next thing, where sort of the incumbent business tends not to do that. They tend to you know, be much less dynamic in how labor moves around. So I think that's another factor.
I think the other mindset shift has to be, less thinking about productivity solely in terms of volume and more in terms of value. So if you think about output and think about it in terms of value, you can get at increased value a lot of different ways, not just from driving more volume. You can have more
Of course.
higher value business models. better value prices that allow you to command a higher price. So I think thinking about that as well is a way to get to what's your strategy for increasing the value that you drive in the market, I think is another way to get to that increased productivity.
Sure, of course, it's not just volume, right? But what you're saying is work the numerator, right? Like, what is the output, and what are the drivers of that output?
Right.
So they're really not that hard to figure out, right? It's sort of, how do we increase demand, right? How do we increase average value per customer, right? However, we're going to define that. How do we average up our price to the real price growth, that kind of thing. Volume does play a
But
role
but
in
I
it,
think
but it's not the only factor.
But I think that the reason why only a small handful of companies are really driving GDP growth, for example, in the US, is because too many leaders are using the incumbent mindset in terms of how they're thinking about productivity and only thinking about it in terms of volume and existing customers as opposed to, where do I really create more value for customers, whether that again is, a new business model, reshaping your customer value proposition, something that really drives more value, not just doing more of what you've been doing.
That's true at the firm level, right? But at
Right,
the
at the firm
national
level.
level, right, if you're just substituting one value for another, that won't show up in the statistic, right? So if I'm selling more at the expense of you and you're selling less, then we're going to be having the same total output, at a national level or a state level or even at a local level. But for you, your productivity is going down because your value has gone down and mine has gone up. You understand what I'm saying,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So I think my only add to your point would be new value matters as
Right,
compared to,
right.
right? Like kind of the zero sum of one trading value, like marginal market share increase where one loses and another increases.
Yeah,
Well,
no,
that
that's
makes me feel better, that's fine. But and
right.
the Nvidias of the world, the Apples of the world, they're creating new value that didn't exist before, right?
Exactly.
That's the key is it's new value. And in the aggregate, we need more new value over time. But again, at the firm level, same thing, right? So we want to work that denominator, not just the numerator, and we do want to create new value.
Right.
Um, but that can feel very difficult if you're in a heavily constrained environment, if demand is flat in a market, which then means that you have to seek new territory for that value, right? Which can feel, risky for leaders
But
that
isn't
aren't
that but isn't that what
operating.
we talk about as in the insurgent mindset,
Of
right? We're
course.
saying innovation is always out there, that you got to experiment, you got to learn, you got to, fail, try things and, learn from them and then find where the next opportunity is. So if you're constantly thinking about your portfolio of innovative ideas and which ones are you going to try to take to the next level, you'll find that new territory or that new opportunity maybe that you want to invest more in. But it's those who are relying on their existing portfolio only and solely thinking about incremental innovation and not more of the longer term innovation, potentially bigger opportunities, having that portfolio mindset. Those are the ones that are not going to find that new value because they're not looking for that, sort of like trying to squeeze as much as they can out of the current, you
Hmm.
know, products.
Yeah. So I guess our lesson for the would-be leader that wants to cultivate the insurgent mindset is fundamentally look for the opportunities to let's start with that. We always work back from the market if we can, right? So, try to find those opportunities to increase that output, which means increasing value, excuse me, which means increasing new sources of value, which means
Hmm.
seeking new markets, which then means exposing yourself to more robust competition, certainly, and all the things that are required to deploy resources to achieve that. So it's sort of like a demand side bias, right?
Yeah.
But on the other
Yeah.
side of the equation, right? So seek the things that are um, impediments to um, your own, your ability to translate that labor and capital into output, right? So
Hmm. Hmm.
streamlining workflows, streamlining policy and regulation, um, making sure that you're really disciplined about harvesting efficiency and productivity benefits as compared to, declaring victory just because you've improved a process. That's not going far enough, right? You actually have to
Hmm.
monetize that. And like we've talked about before, that can be monetized in a number of different ways. It's about investing in the quality, the education, and employment of that workforce as a portfolio of resources on new opportunities. Um,
Yeah.
all of these things have to, and it's about educating your workforce too. There's a lot of change, and certainly, I think here in Australia in particular, there isn't enough focus on, kind of constantly, continuously reskilling the workforce here. And a lot of that education goes into things that don't alleviate constraints to growth, for example,
Right.
or that don't provide an efficiency benefit. And being really clear about where you're going to sort of make those investments is also important.
Yeah, that's, making sure that everyone in the organization understands the strategy and how they contribute to the strategy is a good start as
Mhm.
well, right?
Yeah.
Because
And now
then,
sort of closing the circle back to the national level, right? So all the things that we just talked about, same thing, right? So it's not that difficult, right? So if you're Australian leadership, for example, you want to improve productivity, well, reduce friction in regulation. That's one key driver, right? Create
Mhm.
more incentives to educate the workforce, create more incentives for more labor mobility, create more incentives for firms to invest in innovation. There's no real magic to it. It's just
Yeah.
you actually have to do the things that you know what to do, and somehow we're unable to do them. I think that's the challenge that we face. And the same thing is
Same
faced
here.
by the firm, right? You kind of know what to do, right? All these things are really important, but maybe you're overwhelmed, or maybe you don't really care in a sense that you're happy enough with your current productivity. Um, but only becomes a crisis because in aggregate, not enough firms are making the investments required to drive their productivity. And when you add it all up, it's not enough. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
So now with AI and robotics and automation and things like that, the theory is that we'll be able to employ this technology to create at least more efficiency, so more output per labor hour, but um, we're not necessarily, some firms will be able to capitalize that on the demand side in terms of creating completely new solutions to customers, to your point. Others will not be able to, and they'll be stuck in the efficiency loop, right? So ultimately, they'll monetize that by laying off people. And unless those people can be absorbed in other parts of the economy, um, that's going to cause another set of problems. So I think this
Right.
is the thing we have to think about. And again, I think when we're thinking about technology, we're in kind of a supply side phase where everyone's trying to harvest AI in particular to improve efficiency or make their workflows, you know, more streamlined. But again, it's the demand side that really matters, is how are you creating new sources of value that didn't
Yeah.
exist before? I think that's the shift that we need to see to really be able to harvest the benefits of AI. And we're definitely not there yet.
Yeah, I think the opportunity for AI where it would really start to show up in the productivity numbers is when businesses are thinking about how do I rethink my operating model now that I have this tool, this AI tool, right? Because it's going to be reimagining the operating model, I think, and designing it with AI in mind and not bolting AI onto the existing operating model where the real productivity gains will come from.
Okay, Rondo, but the point isn't so much the operating model. The point is, um, all an operating model um, is a theory of how you organize your labor, right? So,
Right,
you know what I mean? But the point is, how do we how do we build a capability to dynamically reallocate that labor to the next opportunity? That's what we need to be able to do. So
right,
then it comes down to, I think the point I would say from an operating model point of view and a business model point of view is how do you make that more dynamic in a sense of how do you blow apart capability, reassemble it, blow it apart again,
right,
reassemble it
right.
again, right? Rather than creating fixed and rigid structures that prevent you from pivoting and adjusting and reallocating those resources to opportunities. And I think that's the challenge.
And it might include thinking differently about your resource allocation approach, right? Rather, sort of figuring out we've got these resources, what's working. If we invested more in that, can we get more out of it? And so, how do we shift resources from something that's not working to something that is really working and double down on it? How do we stop doing the things that are not working and stop like so having that kind of resource allocation mindset where it's more dynamic and focused on value creation can also help with improved productivity.
Very good. Okay, I think we've run to the end of our rope here, Rondo. So let's wrap it up. And certainly there's a lot more to talk about here, and I imagine we'll pick up that theme again. I also wanted to
Yeah.
remind you that just this last week was our 10th anniversary with Insurgent.
Yes,
So a point for celebration for us in terms of bringing a lot of value and new ideas to the market. So congratulations, Rondo, and
I
the
know.
team at Insurgent
Likewise.
for all your hard work. And I'm pretty excited about the next 10 years.
Absolutely. No, it's hard to believe it's been 10 years already, but it's 10 years. We need
Very
some
good.
balloons. We need some sirens or something going off, right?
There you
Celebration.
go. We can do
Great.
that next time. All right, Rondo. So just a reminder to subscribe to the Insurgent Mindset on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and certainly come back to us with comments and your ideas for guests and topics. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. And so with that, I'm Rondo Moses.
And I'm Matt Tice. Have a great weekend.